Marcus Rodriguez had always been drawn to strange auctions and unusual sales. The 42-year-old construction worker from Phoenix spent his weekends hunting for oddities at estate sales, flea markets, and abandoned storage unit auctions. His small apartment was filled with peculiar finds: vintage tools, mysterious paintings, and antique furniture that told stories of forgotten lives. On a sweltering Saturday morning in July, Marcus received a text from his friend Tommy about an estate sale in the wealthy neighborhood of Paradise Valley. The message was brief but intriguing. Weird stuff today. Old mansion. Family wants everything gone by sunset. Marcus grabbed his coffee and headed out, his pickup truck rattling down the desert roads toward what he hoped would be another treasure hunt. The mansion stood like a fortress against the Arizona sky, its Spanish colonial architecture speaking of old money and older secrets. Cars lined the circular driveway and people wandered in and out carrying boxes, furniture, and curious objects. Marcus noticed the crowd was different from his usual auction buddies. These were serious collectors, antique dealers, and people who looked like they knew exactly what they were searching for. Inside the mansion, rooms were filled with a lifetime of accumulation. Crystal chandeliers hung above Persian rugs, oil paintings covered the walls, and every surface held something that seemed to whisper of mystery. Marcus moved through the crowds, his experienced eye scanning for items that others might overlook. He had learned over the years that the best finds were often the things that seemed ordinary at first glance. In the basement, away from the main crowd, Marcus discovered a section that appeared to have been hastily organized. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, and items were grouped together without much thought. A bored-looking teenager sat behind a folding table with a handwritten sign that read, "Everything must go, make offer." The kid was more interested in his phone than the potential customers browsing through the forgotten treasures. Among the dusty boxes and forgotten furniture pieces, something caught Marcus's attention. In the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old magazines, sat a large burlap sack. It was tied at the top with rough rope and had a small yellowed tag attached that simply read, 1918, handle with care. The sack was heavy, about the size and shape that suggested it contained something substantial, but its contents remained a mystery. Marcus approached the teenager behind the table. "How much for the sack in the corner?" he asked, pointing to his discovery. The kid barely looked up from his phone, glanced in the direction Marcus indicated, and shrugged. "I don't know, man. Make me an offer. My grandmother just wants all this junk gone." "How about $1?" Marcus suggested, expecting negotiation. To his surprise, the teenager nodded immediately. "Sure, whatever. Just take it." Marcus handed over the crumpled bill, wondering if he had just made the deal of a lifetime or purchased someone's forgotten laundry. As he loaded the mysterious sack into his pickup truck, Marcus felt the familiar thrill of the unknown. The weight of the sack suggested something solid inside, and the vintage date on the tag made his collector's heart race with possibilities. Whatever was inside had been carefully stored for over a century, waiting for someone to discover its secrets. Driving home through the Phoenix heat, Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. The sack could contain old tools, vintage clothing, books, or perhaps something even more valuable. He had learned from experience that the most unassuming packages often held the greatest surprises. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, as anticipation built with each mile toward home. Back in his apartment, Marcus placed the sack carefully on his kitchen table. The burlap material was old but remarkably well preserved, and the rope that bound it appeared to be original from 1918. He studied the tag more closely under his kitchen light, noting the careful handwriting and the way the paper had aged to a deep yellow. Whatever was inside had been intentionally preserved, stored with care by someone who believed it was worth keeping. The apartment felt unusually quiet as Marcus prepared to open his latest purchase. Outside, the Arizona sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through his windows. He made himself a cup of coffee, knowing that some discoveries required patience and the right moment. As he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the mysterious sack, Marcus had no idea that he was about to uncover a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about human nature, love, and the power of keeping promises across generations. Marcus carefully untied the rope that had secured the sack for over a century. His fingers worked slowly, treating the aged cord with the respect it deserved. As the rope loosened, he could feel his heart beating faster. Years of treasure hunting had taught him that the moment of revelation was always electric, but something about this particular discovery felt different, more significant somehow. The burlap fell away to reveal an inner wrapping of what appeared to be silk cloth, also aged but in remarkable condition. Beneath the silk, Marcus found himself staring at something that made him blink twice to ensure he was seeing correctly. It was a woman, but not a living woman. Instead, he found himself looking at an incredibly detailed and lifelike mannequin, carved from what appeared to be fine wood and painted with extraordinary skill. The craftsmanship was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. Every detail of the figure was perfect, from the delicate features of her face to the intricate folds of her clothing. Her hair appeared to be real human hair, styled in the fashion of the early 1900s, and her dress was made of actual fabric, carefully preserved and maintained despite its age. Her eyes, made of glass, seemed to look directly at him with an expression that was both serene and somehow alive. But what truly caught Marcus's attention was what surrounded the figure. Carefully arranged around the mannequin were dozens of letters, all tied with ribbons of different colors. Some envelopes were thick, others thin, but all showed the careful handwriting of someone from a bygone era. The letters were organized, chronologically, with dates spanning from 1918 to 1963, 45 years of correspondence. Marcus picked up the first letter, dated July 15, 1918. The envelope was addressed to "My dearest Eleanor" in flowing script. With trembling hands, he opened it and began to read. The letter was from someone named William, writing from what appeared to be a military camp. The words spoke of love, longing, and a promise to return home soon. But as Marcus read further, the story became more complex and heartbreaking. William wrote about Eleanor not as a living person, but as his greatest creation and his most beloved companion. He described how he had spent months carving her likeness, pouring all of his love and devotion into creating something that would never leave him, never disappoint him, and never break his heart the way living people had done before. Eleanor, Marcus realized, was not just a mannequin. She was the product of one man's attempt to create perfect love. The letters revealed William's history. He had been a skilled woodcarver and artist who had experienced profound heartbreak when his fiancée left him for another man just before he was deployed to fight in World War I. Devastated and alone, William had channeled his artistic talents and his emotional pain into creating Eleanor. She became his confidant, his companion, and in his mind, his perfect partner. As Marcus read through more letters, he discovered that William continued writing to Eleanor throughout the war and for decades afterward. Each letter was a window into his life, his struggles with returning from combat, his difficulty connecting with real people, and his growing dependence on the relationship he had created with his wooden companion. The letters were filled with conversations, shared memories that existed only in William's imagination, and plans for their future together. Some letters were cheerful, describing imaginary dates and adventures. Others were darker, revealing William's battles with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress and depression. Eleanor became his anchor, the one constant in a life that had been shattered by war and personal loss. Through the letters, Marcus could see how William's attachment to his creation had both sustained him and isolated him from the real world. Marcus found photographs tucked between the letters, pictures of William posing with Eleanor in various settings around what appeared to be his home. In some images, they were having dinner together. In others, Eleanor was positioned reading a book, while William worked on his woodcarving projects. The photographs showed a man who had created an entire life with his wooden companion, complete with routines, celebrations, and quiet moments that he documented as if they were memories of a real relationship. The more Marcus read, the more complex his feelings became. Initially, he felt disturbed by William's unusual relationship with the mannequin. But as the letters revealed the depth of William's loneliness and pain, Marcus began to understand that Eleanor represented something much deeper than obsession. She was a testament to human resilience and the lengths people will go to find comfort in an often cruel world. The final letters in the collection were the most poignant. Written in the 1960s, they showed William as an elderly man, still devoted to Eleanor but beginning to worry about what would happen to her after his death. He wrote about his fears that she would be thrown away or destroyed, unable to bear the thought that his life's greatest creation and companion would end up forgotten in a garbage dump. Marcus sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by what he had discovered. He had purchased what he thought was a simple antique, but instead had become the guardian of a love story unlike any he had ever encountered. As he looked at Eleanor's serene face, he realized that his $1 purchase had connected him to a profound human story that challenged his understanding of love, loneliness, and the ways people cope with life's deepest disappointments. Marcus spent the entire night reading through William's letters, unable to tear himself away from the extraordinary story unfolding before him. As dawn broke over Phoenix, he had traveled through decades of one man's devotion to his wooden companion. But it was the discovery of William's final letter that truly left him speechless and changed everything he thought he understood about his unusual purchase. The last letter was different from all the others. Instead of being addressed to Eleanor, it was written to whoever finds my beloved Eleanor. The envelope was thick, containing multiple pages and marked, "Urgent, please read first." William had somehow anticipated that someday someone would discover his carefully preserved secret, and he had prepared instructions for that person. In the letter, William explained that Eleanor was not just a mannequin or an art piece. She was his life's work and the repository of a promise he had made to a dying woman in France during World War I. The story that emerged from his final letter was far more complex and touching than Marcus had imagined possible. William wrote about meeting a young French woman named Marie Dubois in 1918 while he was recovering from injuries in a field hospital near the front lines. Marie was a nurse who had been caring for wounded soldiers despite being gravely ill with tuberculosis herself. During the weeks William spent recovering, he and Marie had fallen deeply in love, but both knew that her illness meant their time together would be brief. As Marie's condition worsened, she made William promise that he would create something beautiful to remember her by, something that would carry her spirit forward and ensure she would not be forgotten when the war ended. She described to him in detail how she wanted to be remembered: her favorite dress, the way she styled her hair, her gentle expression, and even the books she loved to read. Marie died in William's arms 3 days before he was scheduled to return to the United States. Heartbroken but determined to keep his promise, William spent months after his return carving Eleanor to match Marie's exact description. Every detail of the mannequin was based on his memories of the woman he had loved and lost in France. Eleanor was not the product of obsession or fantasy. She was a memorial, a promise kept, and a way to ensure that Marie's memory would survive. The letters that Marcus had been reading were never really addressed to a wooden figure. They were William's way of continuing his conversations with Marie, sharing his life with the woman he had loved but could never forget. For 45 years, William had faithfully maintained this connection, treating Eleanor with the reverence of someone tending a grave or maintaining a shrine. But William's final letter revealed even more. He had spent decades researching Marie's family in France, eventually making contact with her surviving relatives. Through careful correspondence, he had learned that Marie had been the sole support for her younger sister's children after their parents died in the war. William had been sending money to Marie's family for over 30 years, using the income from his wood-carving business to support the education and well-being of children he had never met but considered part of Marie's legacy. The letter included a thick folder containing decades of correspondence with Marie's family in France, financial records showing thousands of dollars sent overseas, and photographs of the children and grandchildren whose lives had been changed by William's quiet generosity. Marie's great-niece had become a doctor, inspired by stories of her great-aunt's nursing service. 2 of Marie's great-nephews had become teachers, and one had named his daughter Marie in honor of the aunt whose memory had been kept alive by a stranger from America. William's final instructions were specific and heartbreaking. He wanted whoever found Eleanor to know that she represented not one life, but many lives touched by love and sacrifice. He requested that his story be shared, not because he wanted recognition, but because he believed people should know that love could transcend death, distance, and time. He had left a modest inheritance, held in trust by his lawyer, specifically to continue supporting Marie's family in France. But there was more. William had also left instructions for Eleanor herself. He could not bear the thought of his wooden companion being sold, displayed in a museum, or treated as a curiosity. Instead, he wanted Eleanor to be buried in a small cemetery in France, near the village where Marie had been born. He had even arranged for the burial plot and left detailed instructions for how the ceremony should be conducted. Marcus sat in stunned silence, holding William's final letter and looking at Eleanor with completely new understanding. What he had thought was an unusual antique purchase was actually a sacred trust. William had somehow arranged for Eleanor to end up at that estate sale, knowing that the right person would eventually find her and help him complete his final promise to Marie. The letter included contact information for William's lawyer, who had been maintaining the trust fund and waiting for someone to come forward with Eleanor. William had died 3 years earlier, but his legal arrangements ensured that his final wishes could still be carried out. The lawyer had been instructed to provide funds for Eleanor's transportation to France and to arrange for the memorial service that William had planned. As the morning sun streamed through his apartment windows, Marcus realized that his random $1 purchase had connected him to one of the most extraordinary love stories he had ever encountered. He was not just the owner of an unusual antique. He had become the guardian of a promise that had been kept faithfully for nearly a century, and now it was his responsibility to help William complete his final act of devotion to the woman he had never forgotten. Marcus spent the next week wrestling with the decision that now lay before him. The responsibility of carrying out William's final wishes felt overwhelming, yet he found himself unable to walk away from the trust that had been placed in him. He contacted William's lawyer, an elderly man named Robert Chen, who had been waiting patiently for 3 years for someone to come forward with Eleanor. When Marcus met with Mr. Chen at his downtown Phoenix office, the full scope of William's preparations became clear. The lawyer presented him with detailed documentation spanning decades of William's meticulous planning. There were legal documents establishing the trust fund, correspondence with cemetery officials in France, and even architectural drawings, showing exactly how Eleanor's burial site should be constructed. William had left nothing to chance. He had researched French burial laws, obtained proper permits, and even commissioned a small marble headstone that bore both Marie's name and Eleanor's. The inscription read, Marie Dubois, 1899-1918, beloved nurse and angel of mercy, and below, and Eleanor, her memory made manifest, created with love, laid to rest with honor. Mr. Chen explained that William had been a more complex man than even his letters revealed. After the war, William had become a successful furniture craftsman, but he had lived simply, investing most of his income in the trust fund that supported Marie's family and prepared for Eleanor's eventual journey to France. He had never married, never had children of his own, and dedicated his entire adult life to honoring the memory of a woman he had known for only a few weeks. The lawyer also revealed that William had been in contact with Marie's surviving family in France right up until his death. They knew about Eleanor and had been waiting for years to welcome her to Marie's hometown. The current generation of Marie's family had grown up hearing stories about the American soldier who had loved their great-aunt and had been supporting their family for decades. Marcus learned that Marie's great-niece, Dr. Sophie Moreau, was now a retired physician living in the same French village where Marie had been born. She had been serving as the family's liaison with William for over 20 years and was eager to finally meet Eleanor and help lay her to rest near Marie's childhood home. Dr. Moreau had even learned English specifically to communicate with William and had been heartbroken when she learned of his death. The financial arrangements were generous but came with clear expectations. William had left enough money to cover Eleanor's transportation to France, the burial ceremony, and a modest donation to the local church that would maintain her grave. But Marcus was expected to personally accompany Eleanor on her final journey. William had been specific that Eleanor should not travel alone. She deserved the same respect and care in death that she had received in her decades as William's companion. Marcus found himself deeply moved by William's thorough preparations and clear love for both Marie and Eleanor. But the decision to travel to France with a wooden mannequin felt surreal and challenging. He was a construction worker from Phoenix who had never traveled outside the United States. The thought of explaining Eleanor to airport security, customs officials, and curious strangers seemed overwhelming. However, as Marcus spent more time reading William's letters and studying the photographs of his decades with Eleanor, he began to understand that this was about much more than honoring one man's unusual relationship with a wooden figure. This was about keeping faith with a promise that had sustained someone through a lifetime of loneliness and loss. It was about recognizing that love takes many forms, and that devotion can manifest in ways that others might not understand but should still respect. Marcus also discovered that William had anticipated his hesitation. Among the lawyer's documents was a letter specifically addressed to the person who will help Eleanor complete her journey. In it, William acknowledged that his request was unusual and might seem strange to others. He wrote about his understanding that most people would view Eleanor as just a wooden object, but he asked that person to see beyond the material and recognize the love, memory, and promise she represented. The letter included photos of Marie's family over the decades, children graduating from school, weddings, grandchildren being born, and family gatherings where they would speak of the American benefactor who had made their success possible. William wrote that these lives had been touched and improved because of the promise he had made to Marie, and Eleanor represented the physical manifestation of that continuing connection between past and present. As Marcus read William's final appeal, he realized that refusing to help would mean breaking a chain of love and generosity that had been maintained for nearly a century. Marie's family in France was waiting. Dr. Moreau had been preparing for Eleanor's arrival for years. William had arranged every detail and provided the resources necessary to complete the journey. The decision became clear when Marcus imagined himself in William's position, alone, carrying the weight of a promise made to someone he loved, hoping that someday a stranger would understand and help him keep faith with that commitment. Marcus had always been drawn to forgotten things and overlooked treasures, and now he realized that sometimes the most valuable things are not objects at all, but the stories and connections they represent. 3 weeks after opening the burlap sack, Marcus made the phone call that would change his life. He told Mr. Chen that he would accompany Eleanor to France and help William keep his final promise to Marie. As he hung up the phone and looked at Eleanor's serene face, Marcus felt that he was not just agreeing to transport an unusual cargo, he was becoming part of a love story that had been unfolding for almost a century, and he was honored to help write its final chapter. The journey to France proved to be both challenging and transformative for Marcus. Traveling with Eleanor required careful planning and patience, as airport security and customs officials in both countries needed detailed explanations about the unusual cargo. Marcus carried copies of all of William's documentation, including letters from the French cemetery, the historical significance of the wooden figure, and proof of the burial arrangements. What surprised Marcus most was how respectfully Eleanor was treated once officials understood her story. Instead of viewing her as a strange curiosity, airport workers and customs agents seemed moved by the tale of William's decades-long devotion and his promise to Marie. Several people mentioned that they had never encountered anything like Eleanor's story and wished Marcus well on his mission to complete William's final request. The flight to Paris was Marcus's first time leaving the United States, and he found himself constantly checking on Eleanor, who traveled in a specially designed case that William had commissioned years earlier. The case was lined with velvet and included small windows that allowed Eleanor to see during her journey. Other passengers occasionally asked about the unusual case, and Marcus found himself telling abbreviated versions of William and Marie's story throughout the long flight. In Paris, Marcus was met by Dr. Sophie Moreau, Marie's great-niece, who had driven from her village to escort Eleanor on the final portion of her journey. Dr. Moreau was an elegant woman in her 70s, with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put Marcus at ease. She spoke excellent English and had brought flowers, white roses, that she explained were Marie's favorites, according to family stories passed down through the generations. During the drive through the French countryside to Marie's village, Dr. Moreau shared more details about her family's connection to William. She explained that her grandfather, Marie's younger brother, had often spoken about his sister's sacrifice during the war and her decision to work as a nurse despite her illness. The family had always wondered what had happened to the American soldier Marie had written about in her final letters home. When William first contacted the family in the 1950s, they were amazed to learn that someone had been carrying Marie's memory forward for decades. Dr. Moreau described how William's financial support had transformed her family's circumstances, allowing children to attend university who otherwise would have remained farm workers. She herself had been able to study medicine, partly because of scholarships funded by William's contributions. The village where Marie had been born was small and picturesque, with stone buildings that looked unchanged since the early 1900s. Dr. Moreau took Marcus to see Marie's childhood home, now occupied by distant relatives who maintained a small memorial to Marie in their front garden. The current residents had heard stories about Marie throughout their lives and were honored to meet Marcus and Eleanor. As they walked through the village, Dr. Moreau introduced Marcus to other residents who remembered hearing stories about Marie from their grandparents. The entire community had embraced the story of William's devotion and had been preparing for Eleanor's arrival. The local priest had agreed to conduct a special ceremony, and the cemetery groundskeeper had prepared the burial site according to William's detailed specifications. That evening, Dr. Moreau invited Marcus to dinner with several family members who had gathered to meet Eleanor and hear more about William's life in America. Marcus shared stories from William's letters and photographs, creating a picture of a man who had turned his love for Marie into a lifetime of quiet generosity and remembrance. The family was particularly moved to learn how William had spoken to Eleanor about them over the decades, sharing news about their achievements and celebrating their successes as if he were an actual family member. During the dinner, Marcus realized that Eleanor represented something profound for Marie's family as well. She was not just the product of one man's grief and love. She was a bridge connecting them to their heritage and to a relative they had never met but whose sacrifice had shaped their family's story. Through William's devotion to Eleanor, Marie's memory had been kept alive in ways that traditional memorials could never achieve. The night before Eleanor's burial, Marcus spent time alone with her in his hotel room, reading through William's letters one final time. He found himself speaking to Eleanor, sharing his thoughts about the remarkable journey that had brought them together. Marcus told her about William's devotion, about the family in France who had been waiting to meet her, and about how her story had changed his own understanding of love and commitment. As Marcus prepared for sleep, he reflected on how his random decision to attend an estate sale had connected him to a story that challenged everything he thought he knew about human relationships. William's love for Marie, expressed through his devotion to Eleanor, was unlike any love story Marcus had ever encountered. It was not about possession or fantasy, but about memory, promise-keeping, and the belief that love could transcend death and distance. The morning of Eleanor's burial dawned clear and beautiful. Dr. Moreau arrived at Marcus's hotel with a simple but elegant dress that had belonged to Marie, a blue cotton dress that the family had preserved for nearly a century. They carefully dressed Eleanor in Marie's clothing, creating a visual connection between the woman who had inspired William's devotion and the wooden memorial he had created in her honor. As they prepared to leave for the cemetery, Marcus felt the weight of the moment settling over him. He was about to complete a promise that had been kept faithfully for almost a century, helping to write the final chapter of one of the most unusual and moving love stories he had ever encountered. Eleanor's journey was almost over, but Marcus knew that the impact of her story on his own life was just beginning. The burial ceremony for Eleanor took place on a gentle hillside overlooking the French village where Marie had been born. Nearly 50 people attended, including Marie's family members, village residents, and even representatives from the local historical society who had become fascinated by William and Eleanor's story. The small cemetery was filled with flowers, and the marble headstone that William had commissioned years earlier stood ready to mark Eleanor's final resting place. The village priest, Father Laurent, conducted a moving ceremony that honored both Marie's memory and William's extraordinary devotion. He spoke about love taking many forms and about the power of promises kept across decades and continents. Dr. Moreau delivered a eulogy in both French and English, sharing stories about Marie's courage as a nurse during the war and William's generosity to her family throughout the years. Marcus found himself unexpectedly emotional as Eleanor was lowered into her grave. Over the past month, she had become more than an unusual antique to him. She represented the power of love to inspire generosity, creativity, and dedication that lasted far beyond a single lifetime. As dirt covered the elegant wooden figure, Marcus felt that he was not just burying a mannequin, but witnessing the completion of a love story that had taken nearly a century to reach its conclusion. After the ceremony, the gathered crowd shared stories and memories at a reception in the village hall. Marcus was amazed to meet 3 generations of Marie's family, who had benefited from William's quiet support over the decades. There was Jean-Claude, now a retired teacher whose education had been funded by William's contributions. His daughter, Catherine, was a successful engineer who had named her son William in honor of the American benefactor she had never met. Even the youngest family members knew stories about the soldier who had loved their great-great-aunt and had changed their family's destiny. Dr. Moreau presented Marcus with a folder containing letters that the family had written to William over the years. Dozens of thank you notes, graduation announcements, wedding invitations, and photos that had been sent to Phoenix, but which William had never shared in his letters to Eleanor. Marcus realized that William's generosity had been even greater than his letters had revealed, and that his connection to Marie's family had been deeper and more sustained than even Eleanor had known. During his remaining days in France, Marcus visited the field hospital site where William and Marie had met during the war. Now a peaceful meadow with a small memorial to the medical personnel who had served there, the location helped Marcus better understand the intensity of the love that had developed between 2 people facing the uncertainty of wartime. Standing where William and Marie had fallen in love, Marcus felt the full weight of the promise that had shaped William's entire adult life. The journey back to Phoenix was bittersweet for Marcus. He carried with him copies of all of William's letters, photographs of Eleanor's burial ceremony, and new friendships with Marie's family members who had invited him to return to France any time. But more than souvenirs, Marcus brought back a transformed understanding of love, commitment, and the ways that individual actions can ripple across generations. Back in his apartment, Marcus found that his perspective on his antique hunting hobby had changed completely. He still enjoyed searching for forgotten treasures, but now he approached each item with greater reverence, wondering what stories might be hidden within ordinary objects and what promises might be waiting to be fulfilled. His experience with Eleanor had taught him that the most valuable discoveries are not always financial. Sometimes they are opportunities to become part of something larger than ourselves. Marcus decided to document William and Eleanor's complete story, working with Dr. Moreau to create a comprehensive record of their unusual love story. They collaborated on a book that combined William's letters, photographs of Eleanor, documentation of his support for Marie's family, and accounts of the burial ceremony in France. The book became a testament to the idea that love can transcend conventional boundaries, and that promises kept faithfully can change lives across continents and generations. The story of Eleanor also changed Marcus's own approach to relationships and commitment. Witnessing William's decades of devotion had shown him that love is not just about finding the right person, but about choosing to honor and nurture that love consistently over time. Marcus began volunteering with veterans organizations, helping elderly former soldiers document their own stories and connect with families who had been affected by their service. Years later, Marcus still considers his $1 purchase of Eleanor to be the most important transaction of his life, not because of any financial value, but because it connected him to a story that demonstrated the extraordinary power of ordinary love kept faithful over time. He learned that sometimes the most profound treasures are not objects at all, but opportunities to participate in the completion of promises that have been kept across decades by people who understood that love is not just an emotion, but a commitment to action. The empty space in Marcus's apartment where Eleanor had briefly resided became a reminder of the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to discover the stories that give meaning to our lives. William's devotion to Marie, expressed through his care for Eleanor, had created a legacy of generosity that touched dozens of lives and connected people across continents and generations. Marcus felt honored to have been chosen to help complete William's final promise, and he carried forward the lesson that love, faithfully maintained, can transform not just individual lives, but entire families and communities. In the end, Marcus realized that he had not simply purchased an antique at an estate sale. He had been entrusted with completing one of the most beautiful love stories ever told, and in doing so, had discovered truths about devotion, promise-keeping, and human connection that would guide him for the rest of his life.